Right, and thank you, Barbara, for that detailed presentation on why birds should be allowed to drive.
Truly a remarkable segment.
Absolutely. Next up, we'll be doing a deep dive into a story roughly 70 years in the making, all about how countless indigenous people have been victimized by the U.S. government in relation to nuclear forces. Ivory, would you like to start us off here?
I'd love to, Claire. First off, though, I think it's important to clarify what exactly we mean by indigenous population. I mean, I've heard of that and Native American, but what do the two mean specifically? Are they interchangeable?
Well, I believe they both mean slightly different things technically. Indigenous is in reference to a group of people who were living together before making contact with a settler's nation, while Native American refers to a group of people who lived in what is now the United States before Europeans settled. Though in this situation they are fairly interchangeable.
Interesting. Now, Claire, let me ask you a question. How many nuclear tests do you think were conducted on Western Shoshone lands? Just take a wild guess. 10, 100?
Maybe 200? 500?
In actuality, nearly 1,000 tests by the United States government took place on Shoshone lands in just 40 years. Unfortunately, Western Shoshone is far from the only tribe affected by nuclear testing and mining in the United States. Navajo, Hopi, Spokane, just to name a few, but I could go on and on.
So what do we mean by affected by nuclear testing? Well, the spectrum of effects spans far and wide, but what we're talking about here is what happened to the human populations after being exposed to uranium. One of the many things we know about nuclear testing on Shoshone land is that it wasn't without victim.
You're very sadly right there, Claire. The most prolific nuclear test site the country has ever seen, simply called the Nevada Test Site, sits on Shoshone land. Here, the U.S. government tested 928 times from 1951 to 1992, which is nearly 2 nuclear tests every month for 40 years.
That's awful. Did anyone try to stop it?
Well, the indigenous population didn't have any control over what the U.S. government did, so there was nothing they could really feasibly do. And even if they could stop it, many weren't even told that uranium was harmful in the first place. Side effects from living near the nuclear test site range from heart disease to many forms of cancer to autoimmune conditions where someone's body attacks their own cells.
That sounds horrible.
It is, and since the land and water still hold much higher than normal levels of radioactivity, it isn't just the people born before 1992. It's everyone. Even children and toddlers today have side effects due to radioactivity.
Astounding. Now, I'm getting word from our producer that it wasn't just the nuclear test sites that had such an impact, but also the mining of uranium.
Well, Claire, I am afraid we do not have a producer here.
I guess you're right.
Anyways, seamless transition aside, it is true that a massive amount of uranium exposure comes from mining it. No other indigenous groups face the harsh impact of these mines as much as the Navajo. The nation's lands hold up to 1,000 claims, which are sections of land used for mining.
Now, all of these mines needed workers, of course, so the U.S. government thought, why not employ the First Nation people? Not only were they not paid in actual money, instead being given food products like flour, but this also resulted in constant exposure to radiation.
Physical contact, inhaling, as well as eating and drinking of radioactive materials was not uncommon for the workers. This applied to their families as well, which often included young children. According to the Poulter Center, nearly 85% of all Navajo homes are still currently radioactive.
And it's important to mention that while we've discussed the effects of radiation that we know of now, the true long-term effects of direct and indirect radioactive exposure are still somewhat unknown. Nuclear testing and mining have only happened relatively recently in terms of the last century, so the true effects through generations are still not yet completely known or investigated.
After everything we've learned about the nuclear abuse of the First Nation people, there is very little of what could be considered good news. However, the United States is currently being pressured, and it seems they are finally trying to clean up the indigenous lands they destroyed with uranium. Talks about reparations are now currently taking place.
The most recent announcement is the amendments to the 1990 Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which were introduced to the U.S. Congress in late 2021. These amendments would extend the compensation period by 19 years, extend the designated areas eligible for compensation, widen the scope of people eligible, and also increase the amount of compensation given to victims.
However, there is the idea that with the current maintenance and upkeep of nuclear weapons, the U.S. is keeping a grip on the ability to recreate the circumstances we've seen for so many years.
The cycle of nuclear abuse is only perpetuated when the U.S. keeps and maintains their stockpile of weapons. When we eradicate nuclear weapons from the world, we can finally keep our promise to the First Nation people by ensuring no further nuclear harm.
While we can never truly get close to undoing the horrors of what the United States did to the indigenous populations, making progress towards the eradication of nuclear weapons is at least a step in the right direction.
Truly a terrible situation, but I'm glad there's at least some progress being made. Up next on our UHS News, we'll be looking at a story of how a man heartwarmingly befriended a rabid alligator he found in the streets. Shockingly, this happened in Florida, New York.
Oh wow, that is very shocking. All right, we will see you after the break, folks.